I think many of us struggle with the healing stories of Jesus. I know I have sometimes struggled with that story, or those stories. And thus we also might struggle with the fact that today we'll be doing healing prayers after the sermon and after the Nicene Creed and after the prayers of the people. We'll be inviting people to come forward, either here at the altar or there'll be a moving station to receive the anointing of oil for the purpose of healing. And as Episcopalians, I think we sometimes struggle with that, with those stories, with healing. And we struggle with it because it's not quite our lived experience. I don't know about you, but I have not yet seen someone come into a room and declare, "Get out of him! Silence!" And the other person just sprang out of bed and was full of joy and life again. Right? We haven't experienced that. And so we struggle with this notion of healing and the stories of healing that we get in the Gospels. And so we tend to go closer to one of these two extremes. I don't know how many, but many Episcopalians end up on this end of that spectrum. This end of that spectrum is to kind of scratch our heads and go, I don't know about these healing miracles. They're really nice. Maybe they're just, they're symbolic. They're a literary device. They're just like a symbol that communicates something, but that's about it. What's nice about that end of the pole is it helps make Jesus and the Gospels fit our much more scientific worldview, right? They help the Gospels and Jesus fit into our world a little easier. The problem with it is that you lose the transcendence and wonder of the world. You lose the transcendence and wonder of Jesus when you sort of strip him all down to it's just a story, right? But then we get to the other end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum loves it and is like, why don't we have healing prayers every week? Yes, of course we could pray for healing. And if you just had the right stuff, whatever that right stuff is, whether it's more faith, the right prayer, the right healing minister, or the right priest, or the right whatever, if you had the right stuff in place, of course we'd be having miracles and the healing. It was promised in the Gospels. And so, of course, Jesus healed people miraculously. The problem, of course, over here is that problem of, then why isn't everyone healed? Right? And why didn't that person get healed? And like I said, there's the sort of line that gets charted out of needing to have the right stuff, the right amount of faith, the right prayer, etc. But what that kind of does is it turns the healing stories, turns the miracles themselves into magic, right? And so it's all about incantation, and if you have the right incantation, the magic will happen. But that's not really our faith either. And so we bounce, or sort of move between these two poles, neither of which being fully satisfying. And so if you're like me, sometimes the resolution of this is to just back out of the whole business altogether. I'm just not going to really think about those healing stories. When they come up in the lectionary, I will patiently pray through them, and then I'll think about a good parable or a good teaching. I can chew on that. I can know about that, right? But the problem, even with that position, is that you, all of you have experienced spiritual healing already. You might not have called it that, but you have. Like any of those people who you cannot stand. Yeah, the people who laugh, brave enough to laugh, that person that popped into your mind. Those people who they drive you absolutely nuts, and you cannot spend time around them. You don't just dislike them, you hate them. And when they're in the room, you get those goosebumps on your skin, but not the good kind, right? You know those people. Some of you are chuckling. You're brave enough to know those people. You have those people in your life, and sometimes you, yes, you, have had the experience of probably not in a moment, probably over the course of days, maybe weeks, maybe months or years. Slowly but surely, your heart turned. And they maybe didn't become your best friend, but you could appreciate them. You could see them as a fellow human being who, even though you maybe didn't like them so much, you still could see how at their core they were, I don't know what you would use. I would use the words like lovable, that they were children of God, that they were a fellow human being just like me. Whatever your words are, right? We sometimes call that forgiving, and it is, forgiveness, but if you ever notice how forgiveness doesn't do much for the other person, but what it does is it frees me from the burden of that hatred. It frees me from the tightness of the soul of trying to constantly make the other person my enemy. And that being free of the burden of hatred, that being lightened of that tightness, is a kind of healing for me. Or there's the spiritual healing of coming to more fully and fully accept yourself just as God has made you. Accept yourself for who you are and to know this love for you that is unconditional and embraces you wherever and whoever you are in your life. And as that has slowly unfolded for you, that can be its own kind of spiritual healing. There can also be the spiritual healing of, how do I articulate this one? Of going from a perspective that it all doesn't mean anything and is pointless, a kind of nihilism, but maybe not that far, a kind of like, what's the point of it all? It is just boring scientism. You get what I'm saying. And that evolution of, oh, there's more here. And it is full of meaning and sacredness and holiness. And this precious life I have isn't just pointless, but is in fact full of meaning. All these kinds of journeys you have already been on and have already experienced are themselves a kind of spiritual healing and unfolding. And yeah, it may not have looked like what it looked like in the Gospels, but yet your soul became more free and more filled with love and sacredness. And so we have this problem because we don't really, some of us at least, and I'll join the camp, don't really know what to do with these healing stories of Jesus. I haven't seen someone walk in and miraculously heal someone, and yet I know in my lived experience that spiritual healing does indeed happen, and it is sacred, and it is a mystery, and it is real. And so how do I bring these two together? And for that, I'm going to do something extremely Anglican. And that is talk about the context. I'm going to talk about the context, about our story that we heard about Jesus in the synagogue who heals this man with an unclean spirit. That begins by noting that Jesus was not the only healer in town. We sometimes hear, because we're in the cultural context that we're in, we hear the stories about Jesus doing healings and we think, that's how they knew he was the Son of God, because he could heal people. But that's not actually right. There are tons of recorded stories about lots of rabbis who could go around the countryside and heal people. Josephus, who's an ancient and well-regarded Jewish scholar, writes about them, writes about at minimum 2 different rabbis who, in addition to Jesus, at the same time would have been wandering around doing miraculous healings, right? This is a motif. I didn't want to go that far. This is this is a story. This is I don't know how to say it. This would not have been new. That's how I want to say it. This would not have been new to the listeners, right? They would have known about stories of rabbis, great spiritual leaders who were so rooted in God that they seemed to be able to speak God's own word, and from that word, healing would unfold. Indeed, it harkens back to Moses and Elijah, Old Testament stories of people of God who were so full of grace that they could heal. And indeed, the people in the first century would have absolutely believed these stories to be true, in that they would have really happened, that these people would have really been healed, and hear that and, it's not a but, it's not a yet, it's an and they also would have known that any healing event was not just for the benefit of the person being healed. Their culture, unlike ours, was not so individualistic. It's not all about the individual person. It's about the community, right? And what accompanies all those healing stories, not just in the Jesus Gospels, but in the various rabbis and in the Moses and Elijah, all those healing people, what came with those healings was a sign. The healing itself is a sign, is a communication of something for the benefit of all. And indeed, in this story that we read in the center of our sanctuary, Jesus goes to the synagogue. The synagogue is not like contemporary American churches. They don't get just used one day a week. The synagogue was used all week long. It would have been used one day a week for worship. Jesus was certainly in that setting by going into the synagogue on a Sabbath. But the synagogue was like the public square, but inside a building. It was not where you shopped, but it was where you went to get the administration of justice. It is where you went to work out, how is our common life together going to work? It was the place you went to resolve community disputes. The synagogue was the center of public life. And Jesus goes into the center of that public life. And he does this healing, and it's not just for the man who is healed. He certainly benefits from it, no question. But it is also to be a sign and a communication to all those gathered. So I hope by now you're asking, what is the communication? And for that, I think we have to look at, what does the voice of the unclean spirit say? And the voice of the unclean spirit says, Jesus of Nazareth, what are you to do with us? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And I think we sometimes, rightly or wrongly, I don't really know, but sometimes one way of reading that is that it's a sort of like a demon character, right? Some sort of like soldier of Satan who's like gearing up to have some sort of battle with Jesus and the armies of God, I guess, and they're going to have some battle, and there's going to be being destroyed happen. And another way to sort of hear that is indeed anytime these rabbis, these healing rabbis, these spiritual leaders of the Hebrew people would gain enough of a following that people would gather, hear them speak, and listen to them, it always made a certain group nervous. And that group was Rome. That Rome, the Roman Empire who ruled over this territory, didn't really like it when there were these itinerant healers who would go around and gather a whole group of people around them, people who would follow them and listen to them. It made them rather nervous. And Rome knew one way to keep everyone in line, and that was to destroy those who wanted to exit the line. It was to destroy them, right? And so anytime these Jewish leaders would come up and seem to have some authority, maybe perhaps like John the Baptist, we heard about in the the last few weeks, would come up, then they'd be arrested and destroyed. And so perhaps, just perhaps this unclean spirit that speaks in the center of the community's life, Jesus, what are you to do with us? Have you come to destroy us? Is less a otherworldly supernatural voice and is the community's fear. That insidious fear that comes up in my heart, and certainly in some of your hearts, that comes up as we try to follow the way of the gospel, as we try to follow Jesus, as we try to follow this way of love that often takes us quite the opposite direction of where our culture would like us to go, that there can be this fear that interrupts things, cuts things off, shuts it down. Jesus, are you going to destroy me? If following your path, it's going the opposite direction of where culture wants me to go. Is it going to lead to my destruction? Me losing everything? And that fear, perhaps that fear is the unclean spirit. And so as Jesus says to the spirit, silence, come out of him. May it be a word spoken to your heart. That whatever fears and anxieties plague you, whatever fear you have that keeps you small, whatever fears you have that keep you from loving your neighbor as yourself, that those fears be silent. Let those fears come out of you so that you might be more free to love and to serve. And so, as I invite you, as we come to this recollection, this reflection on healing, as we anoint you with oil and pray over you, I invite you to reflect on a question. What fear of yours do you hold, and that you are ready to let go?